Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you become the very ones who destroy you piece by piece until you feel like nothing more than a shadow of who you once were. Imagine trusting your family completely, only to discover that one person's cruelty could strip away everything you believed about love, safety, and your own worth. Good morning, my precious souls. This is Grandma Dorothy, and at 78 years old, I'm sitting here in my little kitchen in Charleston, South Carolina, watching the morning sun dance across the magnolia trees outside my window. The sweet tea is brewing, the biscuits are cooling on the counter, and I can hear the distant sound of church bells calling folks to Sunday service. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Today I want to share with you a story I've kept buried in the deepest corners of my heart for over 50 years. It's a story about how sometimes the devil doesn't come with horns and a pitchfork, but with a familiar face and a place at your family dinner table. It's about how I learned that blood doesn't always mean love, and how the coldest winter I ever experienced wasn't outside in the December snow, but inside the walls of what should have been my safe haven. I was born in 1945 in a small town called Millbrook, nestled in the rolling hills of Tennessee where the tobacco fields stretched as far as the eye could see, and everyone knew everyone else's business before they knew it themselves. My daddy, James Crawford, worked the railroad that connected our little town to the bigger cities, and my mama, Ruth, took in sewing to help make ends meet. We weren't rich by any stretch, but we had love in abundance, or so I thought. I was the youngest of 4 children, with 3 older brothers who treated me like their little princess. There was Thomas, the eldest at 8 years older than me, then Samuel, and finally William, who was just 3 years my senior. Our house was always filled with laughter, the smell of Mama's cornbread, and the sound of Daddy's harmonica echoing from the front porch after supper. Growing up in the 1950s in rural Tennessee meant that summers were spent catching fireflies in mason jars, helping Mama tend to her vegetable garden, and listening to the older folks tell stories on the wraparound porch while the cicadas sang their evening songs. Life moved at a gentle pace, and I felt wrapped in the warm embrace of family tradition and small-town values. When I turned 16 in 1961, I caught the attention of a young man named Daniel Patterson who worked at the local bank. Daniel was everything a girl could dream of in those days. Tall, with sandy brown hair that caught the sunlight, gentle green eyes, and manners that would make any mama proud. He came from a respectable family, attended church every Sunday, and had prospects for a good future in banking, or maybe even law. Daniel courted me properly, as was expected in those days. He would sit with me on the front porch swing while Mama watched from the kitchen window, bring me wildflowers he picked along the country roads, and write me sweet letters that I kept tied with a ribbon in my hope chest. After 2 years of courtship, he asked Daddy for my hand in marriage, and on a beautiful spring morning in 1963, when I was just 18 years old, I walked down the aisle of Millbrook Baptist Church in Mama's wedding dress, feeling like I was stepping into a fairy tale. Those first months of marriage were everything I had dreamed they would be. Daniel and I moved into a small house on Elm Street, just 3 blocks from Mama and Daddy. I spent my days learning to be a proper wife, perfecting Mama's recipes, and decorating our little home with hand-embroidered linens and the quilts Mama had made for my hope chest. Daniel would come home from the bank each evening, and we would sit on our own front porch, planning our future and talking about the children we hoped to have. It was during our 2nd year of marriage that Daniel's older brother Robert came back to Millbrook. Robert had been away for nearly 5 years, first serving in the Army and then working construction jobs in cities like Nashville and Memphis. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Daniel always spoke of his brother with such admiration, telling me stories about how Robert had protected him when they were boys, how he was the smart one, the strong one, the one who was going to make something of himself in the big world beyond our small town. When Robert finally returned home, I was so excited to meet this legendary figure from Daniel's childhood stories. Daniel had prepared me to meet someone remarkable, someone who would sweep me off my feet with his worldliness and charm. The day Robert walked through our front door, carrying a single worn suitcase and wearing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, I felt an immediate chill that I couldn't explain. Robert was indeed impressive at first glance. He was taller than Daniel, broader in the shoulders, with the same green eyes but darker hair and a presence that seemed to fill whatever room he entered. He spoke with confidence about the places he'd been and the things he'd seen, regaling us with stories of city life and opportunities that made our quiet existence in Millbrook seem small and insignificant. Daniel was overjoyed to have his brother back. He insisted that Robert stay with us until he could find a place of his own and get back on his feet. Our little house on Elm Street suddenly felt much smaller, with Robert's commanding presence filling the spare room. He had opinions about everything: how I kept house, how Daniel conducted his business at the bank, how the people of Millbrook were all small-minded and lacking in ambition. At first, I tried to see Robert the way Daniel did. I wanted to love my brother-in-law, to welcome him into our home and our lives with open arms. I prepared his favorite meals, washed and pressed his clothes, and listened politely to his endless stories about life beyond our small town. But something about the way he looked at me, the way he spoke to me when Daniel wasn't around, made my skin crawl with an uneasiness I couldn't name. Robert had a way of making comments that seemed harmless on the surface but left me feeling diminished and uncomfortable. He would comment on my cooking, suggesting that women in the cities knew how to prepare more sophisticated dishes. He would critique my appearance, mentioning how women in Memphis dressed with more style and elegance. When I would share news about friends from church or happenings around town, he would roll his eyes and make remarks about how provincial and boring everything was in Millbrook. The first time Robert really showed his true nature was on a cold November evening in 1964. Daniel had been called away to Nashville on bank business and wouldn't be home until the following afternoon. I was in the kitchen preparing supper when Robert came in from whatever he'd been doing all day. The unemployment that was supposed to be temporary had stretched into months, and I could see Daniel beginning to worry about the strain on our modest household budget. Robert stood in the kitchen doorway, watching me stir the pot of stew I'd been simmering all afternoon. There was something different about his posture, something predatory in the way his eyes followed my movements around the kitchen. When I asked him to sit at the table so I could serve him, he didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You know, Dorothy," he said, his voice lower than usual, "Daniel really doesn't deserve someone like you. He's always been the weak one in our family, content with his little life and his little dreams. A woman with your potential could do so much better." I felt my heart begin to race with a fear I couldn't quite understand. Robert was family, Daniel's beloved brother, the man who was supposed to protect and respect me as his sister-in-law. But the way he was looking at me, the way he moved closer still until I was backed against the kitchen counter, made every instinct in my body scream that something was very wrong. "I think you should sit down now, Robert," I managed to say, my voice trembling slightly. "Supper's ready and you must be hungry." He laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. It was cold and mocking, like the laughter of someone who found amusement in another person's discomfort. Always so proper, always so concerned with doing the right thing. Do you ever wonder what it would be like to do something wild, something spontaneous? When I tried to move away from the counter to put some distance between us, Robert placed his hand on the counter beside me, effectively trapping me in place. His other hand reached out and touched my face, running his fingers along my cheek in a way that made my stomach turn with revulsion. "Robert, please," I whispered, tears beginning to blur my vision. "Daniel will be back tomorrow." "He wouldn't want you to." "Daniel doesn't have to know about everything that happens in his house, does he?" Robert's voice was barely above a whisper now, but the menace in it was unmistakable. "After all, I'm family. We're just getting to know each other better." I somehow found the courage to duck under his arm and flee to our bedroom, where I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, shaking uncontrollably. I could hear Robert moving around the kitchen, the sound of dishes clinking as he served himself the dinner I'd prepared. Later, I heard the front door slam as he left the house, probably headed to one of the taverns on the other side of town. That night, alone in the house with the doors locked and every shadow seeming to hide a threat, I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. I decided not to tell Daniel what had happened. Robert was his brother, his hero, the person he'd looked up to his entire life. How could I destroy that relationship with accusations that Robert would surely deny? What if Daniel didn't believe me? What if he chose his brother over his wife? The next evening, when Daniel returned from Nashville full of excitement about a potential promotion at the bank, I smiled and welcomed him home as if nothing had happened. Robert had returned to the house by then, acting as if the incident in the kitchen had never occurred. He was charming and brotherly, helping to carry in Daniel's luggage and asking about the business trip with apparent genuine interest. As the weeks passed, I began to hope that the incident had been an aberration, perhaps the result of too much whiskey and too much idle time. Robert seemed to be making an effort to find work, and he was more respectful in his interactions with me, at least when Daniel was present. I started to relax, to believe that we could all continue living together as a family should. But my relief was short-lived. Robert had simply learned to be more careful, more calculating in his approach. When Daniel was at work, Robert would find excuses to be in whatever room I was occupying. If I was hanging laundry in the backyard, he would appear to help carry the basket. If I was cleaning the house, he would offer to move furniture or reach high shelves. Always, his hands would linger a moment too long when they brushed against mine. Always, his eyes would watch me with that predatory intensity that made me feel like prey being stalked by a patient hunter. The psychological warfare was subtle but relentless. Robert would make comments about how lonely I must get during the long days when Daniel was at work. He would suggest that I seemed tense, that I needed someone to help me relax. He would position himself so that I would have to squeeze past him in narrow hallways, so that his body would brush against mine in ways that seemed accidental but felt deliberately invasive. Worse than the physical intimidation was the way Robert began to undermine my confidence and my sense of reality. He would rearrange things in the house and then act confused when I mentioned that items were not where I had left them. He would contradict my recollections of conversations, making me doubt my own memory. He would make plans with Daniel that involved all three of us, then create situations where Daniel would be called away at the last minute, leaving me alone with Robert despite my obvious reluctance. The isolation began gradually. Robert would make comments to Daniel about how I seemed unfriendly to visitors, how I was becoming antisocial and withdrawn. He would suggest that perhaps I was struggling with the adjustment to married life, that maybe I needed time to mature into my role as a wife. These suggestions, coming from someone Daniel trusted and admired, began to influence how my husband saw me. Daniel started asking why I didn't seem to enjoy Robert's company, why I always found excuses to visit Mama when Robert was around, why I seemed so nervous and unhappy when the three of us were together. His questions weren't accusatory, but they carried an undertone of disappointment that cut me to the core. I could see my husband beginning to wonder if perhaps his brother was right, if perhaps I was the problem in our household. The winter of 1965 was particularly harsh in Tennessee, with ice storms and snow that kept the whole town locked indoors for days at a time. Daniel's promotion at the bank meant longer hours and occasionally overnight trips to other branches in neighboring counties. These absences, which once would have been minor inconveniences, became sources of dread that kept me awake at night and filled my days with anxiety. It was during one of these winter storms, when the power had been out for 2 days and Daniel was stranded in Cookeville due to impassable roads, that Robert's campaign of psychological torture escalated to a level that nearly broke me completely. The house was cold, so cold that our breath formed clouds in the air, and we were burning furniture in the fireplace to stay warm. I was in the kitchen, trying to prepare a meal, using only the fire from the hearth, when Robert approached me with a blanket. At first I thought it was a genuinely kind gesture, an offer to help me stay warm while I worked. But when he wrapped the blanket around my shoulders, his hands lingered, and his body pressed close behind me in a way that made every muscle in my body tense with fear. "You're shivering so much, Dorothy," he murmured, his breath hot against my ear. "Let me help you get warm." When I tried to step away, Robert's arms tightened around me, holding me in place. The blanket that was supposed to provide comfort became a prison, trapping my arms at my sides and preventing me from defending myself. I could feel his heartbeat against my back, could smell the whiskey that had become his constant companion during these dark winter days. "Please, Robert," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "Please don't do this. I'm your brother's wife." This isn't right." His laughter was soft and cruel. "Daniel isn't here, is he? Daniel can't protect you from the cold, can't keep you warm the way a real man could. Face it, Dorothy. You married the wrong brother." The terror I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I was trapped in my own home, miles from any neighbor who might hear me scream, with a man who clearly had no respect for the bonds of family or the sanctity of marriage. The cold that gripped me then wasn't just from the winter storm raging outside, it was the cold of absolute helplessness, of knowing that no one was coming to save me. Somehow, perhaps by the grace of God, or simply through the desperation of a cornered animal, I managed to break free from Robert's grasp. I stumbled toward the bedroom, the blanket tangling around my feet, and nearly sending me crashing to the floor. Behind me, I could hear Robert's footsteps following, could hear him calling my name in a voice that was both cajoling and threatening. I slammed the bedroom door and turned the lock, then dragged the heavy dresser in front of it for additional protection. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and inside, I could hear Robert pacing in the hallway, occasionally testing the door handle, or knocking softly, and calling my name in that same disturbing tone. For 3 days I remained barricaded in that bedroom while the storm raged, and Robert prowled through the house like a caged predator. I had no food except for a few crackers I found in a dresser drawer, and no water except what I could collect from the icicles forming on the window ledge. The cold was so intense that I could no longer feel my fingers or toes, and my breath came in short, painful gasps that burned my lungs. But the physical cold was nothing compared to the ice that was forming around my heart, the numbness that was creeping through my soul like frostbite of the spirit. I began to understand that this was how Robert intended to break me, not through one dramatic act of violence, but through a slow, methodical process of wearing away my resistance until I was too exhausted and too broken to fight anymore. When Daniel finally returned home after the roads were cleared, he found me huddled in the bedroom, weak from hunger and exposure, my lips blue with cold and my body shaking uncontrollably. Robert, of course, had a perfectly reasonable explanation for my condition. He told Daniel that I had been acting strangely since the power went out, that I had locked myself in the bedroom and refused to come out despite his repeated attempts to check on my welfare. "I was worried sick about her, Danny," Robert said, his voice filled with what sounded like genuine concern. "She wouldn't answer when I knocked, wouldn't let me bring her food or blankets. I think the isolation and the cold might have affected her mind somehow." Daniel looked at me with confusion and growing worry. He saw his wife in an obviously distressed state, and he saw his trusted brother offering a reasonable explanation for her condition. When he asked me what had happened, what could I say? How could I explain that I had been hiding from his beloved brother, that the man he idolized had been terrorizing me in ways that left no physical evidence? "I was cold," I whispered, which was true enough. I was so cold, and I couldn't get warm. Daniel wrapped me in every blanket we owned and built up the fire until the house was almost stifling. He made me hot soup and tea, rubbing my hands and feet to restore circulation while speaking to me in the gentle, worried tones one might use with an invalid or a child. But even as my body began to warm, something deep inside me remained frozen, locked away in a place where Daniel's love and kindness couldn't reach. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, I made a decision that would define the next several years of my life. I decided to stop fighting. The battle to maintain my sanity and my sense of self was too exhausting, too painful and too isolating. If I couldn't make Daniel understand what was happening, if I couldn't protect myself from Robert's psychological warfare, then perhaps the only way to survive was to simply stop caring. I began to retreat into myself, to build walls around my heart and my mind that would protect me from feeling the full impact of Robert's cruelty. When he would make his inappropriate comments or create his uncomfortable situations, I would simply go somewhere else in my mind, imagining myself back in Mama's kitchen or sitting by the creek behind our old house. Anywhere but in the reality of my current existence. The numbness that crept over me was both a blessing and a curse. It protected me from the immediate pain of Robert's psychological attacks, but it also cut me off from everything else that had once brought joy and meaning to my life. I stopped laughing at Daniel's jokes, stopped taking pleasure in cooking his favorite meals, stopped feeling excitement about the future we had once planned together. Daniel noticed the change in me, of course. How could he not? The vibrant, affectionate young woman he had married was slowly disappearing, being replaced by someone who moved through life like a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit. He would ask me what was wrong, what he could do to help, how he could bring back the happiness that had once lit up my eyes. But how could I explain that the problem wasn't him, wasn't our marriage, wasn't anything he could fix? How could I tell him that his brother, the man he loved and trusted above all others, was slowly destroying his wife's soul with a campaign of psychological torture so subtle that it left no evidence, no proof, nothing but my word against that of a man Daniel had idolized since childhood? Robert, seeing how effectively his tactics were working, became bolder in his approach. He would sit too close to me when the three of us were together, his leg pressing against mine under the dining room table. He would find excuses to touch my shoulder or my hand while speaking, always in ways that appeared innocent to any observer but felt violating and wrong to me. He would make comments about my appearance, my cooking, my housekeeping that seemed complimentary on the surface but carried undertones of criticism and ownership that made my skin crawl. The spring of 1966 brought no relief from the psychological winter that had settled over my life. If anything, Robert's campaign intensified as he realized how effectively he had isolated me, how thoroughly he had undermined my relationship with Daniel, and my confidence in my own perceptions. He began making suggestions about how I could improve myself, how I could become more sophisticated and worldly, how I could shed the provincial attitudes that he claimed were holding me back. These suggestions always involved activities or changes that would distance me further from the support systems that had once sustained me. He would suggest that I was too dependent on my family, that constant visits to Mama's house were a sign of immaturity. He would hint that my friendships with other young women in town were shallow and limiting, that I needed to broaden my horizons beyond the narrow confines of Millbrook society. Daniel, influenced by his brother's apparent concern for my development and happiness, began to echo these suggestions. He would encourage me to be more independent, to try new things, to step outside my comfort zone. His intentions were loving, but the effect was to further erode the foundations of my identity and my sense of belonging in the world. The isolation became complete when Robert convinced Daniel that we should move to a larger house on the outskirts of town, a place where Robert could have more space and privacy while he looked for work, and where we could all have a fresh start as a family. The house Daniel found was beautiful in many ways, with more room and modern conveniences, but it was also remote, situated on several acres of wooded land, with no close neighbors and no easy access to the community that had once been my anchor. In this new house, miles from Mama's protective presence and the familiar faces of friends and neighbors, Robert's control over my daily existence became absolute. He would create elaborate scenarios designed to test my obedience and compliance, subtle power games that reinforced his dominance while appearing to be normal family interactions. If I prepared a meal he didn't like, he would suggest to Daniel that perhaps I needed cooking lessons. If I expressed an opinion he disagreed with, he would gently redirect the conversation in ways that made my contributions seem naive or inappropriate. If I showed any signs of happiness or independence, he would find ways to undermine those moments with comments or actions that reminded me of my powerlessness. The psychological imprisonment was so complete that I began to lose track of who I had been before Robert entered our lives. The confident, joyful young woman who had walked down the aisle of Millbrook Baptist Church seemed like someone from a dream, someone I had perhaps imagined but never actually been. In her place was this hollow shell of a person who moved through each day like a sleepwalker, performing the motions of living without actually being alive. Daniel, watching his wife disappear before his eyes, became increasingly frustrated and concerned. He would plead with me to tell him what was wrong, what he could do to help restore the happiness we had once shared. But Robert was always there with explanations and suggestions, always ready to interpret my behavior in ways that deflected attention from his own role in my deteriorating condition. "I think Dorothy is struggling with depression, Danny," Robert would say with apparent compassion. It's not uncommon for young wives to go through periods of adjustment and melancholy. Perhaps she needs professional help. Or maybe just time to work through whatever is troubling her. The suggestion that I might be mentally ill was the final nail in the coffin of my resistance. If even my own husband could be convinced that my perceptions were unreliable, that my distress was a product of mental instability rather than external circumstances, then what hope did I have of ever being believed or protected? I stopped trying to communicate my distress to Daniel. I stopped hoping that he would somehow see through his brother's manipulations and rescue me from the nightmare my life had become. Instead, I retreated further into the numbness that had become my only protection, accepting my fate as someone who was destined to live as a shadow in her own existence. The months that followed blurred together in a haze of psychological survival. I learned to anticipate Robert's moods and manipulations, to navigate the minefield of his expectations and demands. While appearing to be a normal, functioning member of the household, I became an expert at hiding my true feelings, at presenting a facade of compliance while protecting the tiny spark of my authentic self that still flickered somewhere deep inside. But even as I learned to survive in this atmosphere of controlled terror, I could feel pieces of my soul breaking off and floating away like ice flows in a spring thaw. Each day brought new evidence that I was disappearing, that the person I had once been was being systematically erased by someone who seemed to take pleasure in the process of psychological destruction. The worst part wasn't the fear or the humiliation or even the complete isolation from everything I had once loved. The worst part was the growing realization that I was beginning to forget what it felt like to be whole, to be valued, to be truly alive. The numbness that had once been my protection was becoming my prison, and I began to wonder if there would ever be a way back to the light. The summer of 1966 arrived with a heat so oppressive it seemed to press down on everything like a heavy blanket, making even the simplest tasks feel overwhelming. Our new house, which Daniel had been so proud of, became a furnace during the day, and the isolation that had seemed peaceful in the cooler months now felt suffocating. Robert had still not found steady work, though he claimed to be pursuing various opportunities that never seemed to materialize into actual employment. I had settled into a routine of invisible existence, moving through each day like a ghost haunting her own life. My mornings began before dawn, when I would slip quietly from bed to prepare breakfast while both men still slept. These early hours became my sanctuary, the only time when I could breathe freely without feeling Robert's eyes tracking my every movement or anticipating his next psychological maneuver. Daniel had grown increasingly distant, not from lack of love, but from a kind of helpless frustration that seemed to consume him. He would watch me moving through our home like a stranger, performing my duties with mechanical precision, but without any of the warmth or joy that had once characterized our domestic life together. I could see the confusion in his eyes when he looked at me, the way he struggled to understand how the vibrant woman he had married had become this hollow version of herself. Robert, meanwhile, had refined his campaign of psychological warfare to an art form. He no longer needed to make overt threats or engage in obvious intimidation. His mere presence in a room was enough to make my entire body tense with anxiety. He had learned to weaponize normalcy, turning ordinary family interactions into minefields where every word and gesture carried the potential for humiliation or emotional assault. The breakfast table became a particularly treacherous landscape. Robert would sit across from me, his eyes never leaving my face as I served the meal I had prepared. He would comment on the food, always in ways that seemed appreciative but carried subtle criticisms that undermined my confidence. If the eggs were slightly overcooked, he would mention how women in the city had mastered the art of perfect preparation. If the coffee was too strong, he would observe that refined palates preferred a more delicate brew. Daniel, eager to maintain peace in the household and perhaps hoping to bridge whatever gap he perceived between his wife and his brother, would often echo Robert's suggestions. He would encourage me to try new recipes, to experiment with different cooking techniques, never realizing that each suggestion felt like confirmation that I was inadequate, that nothing I did could ever meet the standards that were being imposed upon me. The garden that I had started behind the house became another source of psychological manipulation. What had begun as my attempt to create something beautiful and nurturing in my increasingly barren world quickly became yet another arena for Robert's subtle dominance. He would offer to help with the heavy work, positioning himself close enough that his body would brush against mine as we worked. He would critique my planting choices, suggesting that someone with more sophisticated tastes might choose different varieties of flowers or vegetables. When my tomatoes failed to thrive in the harsh summer heat, Robert was quick to point out that perhaps gardening required more knowledge and experience than I possessed. When my roses attracted aphids, he mentioned that proper garden maintenance was clearly more complicated than rural people understood. Each failure in my garden became evidence of my general incompetence, another confirmation that I was not capable of succeeding at even the simplest tasks. The isolation of our new home made these psychological assaults even more devastating because there was no relief, no escape to places where I might remember who I had been before Robert entered our lives. Mama lived too far away for casual visits, and the friends I had made in town rarely ventured out to our remote location. I was trapped in a bubble of controlled reality where Robert's version of events was the only narrative that mattered. Daniel's work at the bank began requiring longer hours and more frequent travel as his responsibilities increased. While part of me was grateful for any reprieve from the tension that filled our house when all three of us were present, these absences also meant longer periods alone with Robert. Longer stretches of time when I had no witness to his behavior and no protection from his increasingly bold psychological intrusions. It was during one of Daniel's trips to Memphis that Robert escalated his campaign in a way that shattered what remained of my resistance. I was in the laundry room, hanging clothes on the line that stretched between two oak trees behind the house. The late afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard and creating pockets of darkness that seemed to hide unseen threats. Robert appeared silently, the way he had learned to move through the house like a predator stalking prey. I didn't hear his approach until he was close enough that I could feel his presence behind me, close enough that the familiar smell of whiskey and aftershave that had become associated with fear filled my nostrils. "You look tired, Dorothy," he said, his voice carrying that false concern that had become his trademark. "All this domestic work must be wearing you down. A woman like you shouldn't have to struggle so hard just to keep up with basic household tasks." I continued hanging the wet clothes, keeping my hands busy, and my eyes focused on the simple task before me. Experience had taught me that acknowledging his comments often led to longer, more uncomfortable conversations, while ignoring them sometimes caused him to lose interest and move on to other activities. But Robert was not in a mood to be ignored. He moved closer, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body in the warm summer air. When I reached for another piece of clothing from the basket, his hand intercepted mine, his fingers closing around my wrist, with a grip that was firm enough to prevent movement, but not quite hard enough to leave visible bruises. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, Dorothy," he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that made every nerve in my body scream with alarm. "It's rude to ignore family, especially when they're trying to help you." I had no choice but to turn and face him, to meet those cold green eyes that seemed to see right through me to some vulnerable core that he delighted in tormenting. His free hand reached up to touch my face, his thumb tracing along my cheekbone in a gesture that might have appeared tender to any observer but felt like a violation of the most intimate kind. "You're so tense all the time," he murmured, his thumb moving down to trace the line of my jaw. "So frightened and skittish, like a wild animal that needs to be tamed. What are you so afraid of, Dorothy? I'm family. I would never hurt you." The lie was so blatant, so cruel in its obvious falseness, that something inside me finally snapped. For months, I had endured his psychological torture in silence, had absorbed his manipulations and mind games without fighting back, had allowed him to systematically dismantle my sense of self and my connection to reality. But in that moment, with his hands on me and his lies poisoning the air between us, I found a spark of the person I used to be. "Let go of me," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "Take your hands off me right now." Robert's eyes widened slightly, as if he were surprised to discover that I was still capable of resistance. Then his grip tightened, and his other hand moved to my shoulder, holding me in place while his face moved closer to mine. "There she is," he said with genuine satisfaction. There's the fire I knew was hiding under all that timid compliance. I was beginning to think my brother had married a completely spineless woman. But you've got some fight left in you after all. I tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong, and the laundry basket blocked my retreat on one side, while his body trapped me on the other. The wet clothes hung around us like curtains, creating a sense of enclosed privacy that made the situation feel even more threatening and inescapable. What do you think would happen if I told Daniel you tried to seduce me? Robert asked, his voice conversational, as if he were discussing the weather or the crops. Do you think he would believe you, or do you think he would believe his brother, the man he's looked up to his entire life? The question hit me like a physical blow because I knew the answer. Robert had spent months carefully crafting a narrative in which I was unstable, depressed, possibly mentally ill. He had positioned himself as the concerned brother-in-law, trying to help his troubled sister-in-law, while painting me as someone whose perceptions could not be trusted. If it came down to his word against mine, I had no doubt about whom Daniel would believe. "You're insane," I whispered, but even as I said the words, I could hear how weak they sounded, how unconvincing they would be to anyone who had been watching Robert's careful performance over the past months. "Am I?" Robert's smile was cold and predatory. "Or am I just more honest than most people about what I want? You're a beautiful woman, Dorothy, wasted on a man who doesn't have the backbone to appreciate what he has. Daniel treats you like a china doll. Something fragile and decorative, but not really substantial. I see the real woman underneath all that proper Southern lady facade." His words were designed to confuse me, to make me question not just his intentions but my own perceptions of my marriage and my worth as a person. This was Robert's particular genius, his ability to twist reality until his victims began to doubt their own experiences and judgments. "Daniel loves me," I said, but the words came out sounding more like a question than a statement. "Does he?" Robert's hand moved from my shoulder to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. "When was the last time he really looked at you, really saw you? When was the last time he made you feel like a woman instead of a household convenience?" The terrible thing about Robert's psychological warfare was that he had an uncanny ability to identify real vulnerabilities and exploit them. It was true that Daniel had been distant lately, preoccupied with work and confused by my own withdrawal from our relationship. It was true that our physical intimacy had suffered as my psychological state deteriorated. Robert was taking these real strains in our marriage and using them as weapons against me. "He's working hard for our future," I said, trying to defend my husband and my marriage against these insidious attacks. "He's running away," Robert corrected. "He can't handle having a real woman with real needs and real desires. That's why he spends so much time at the bank, why he takes every opportunity to travel. He's scared of the passion he sees in you, scared that he's not man enough to satisfy it." I closed my eyes, trying to block out his words, but Robert's voice continued its relentless assault on my defenses. He had learned to weaponize truth, taking genuine problems and twisting them into justifications for his own predatory behavior. "Open your eyes, Dorothy," he commanded, his grip on my hair tightening until it was almost painful. "Look at me and tell me you don't feel something when I touch you. Tell me you don't wonder what it would be like to be with a man who isn't afraid of your fire." When I opened my eyes, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down completely, I saw something in his expression that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't just desire or even cruelty. It was ownership. Robert looked at me the way a collector might look at a rare specimen, something to be acquired and displayed and ultimately destroyed through the very act of possession. "I hate you," I whispered, and for the first time in months, I meant every word I spoke with complete honesty. "No, you don't," Robert replied with infuriating confidence. "You hate that you're attracted to me. You hate that I see through all your pretenses and defenses. You hate that I make you feel things your husband never could." The psychological manipulation was so skillful, so insidious, that for a moment I actually began to doubt my own feelings. Was it possible that some part of me was attracted to this man who had made my life a living hell? Was there some hidden masochistic streak in my personality that drew me to the very person who was destroying me? But then I remembered the terror of those nights when Daniel was away, the way I would barricade myself in our bedroom and lie awake listening for Robert's footsteps in the hallway. I remembered the constant anxiety that had become my daily companion, the way my hands would shake when I heard his voice calling my name. Whatever Robert wanted me to believe about my feelings, the truth was that every cell in my body recoiled from his presence. "Let me go," I said again, putting all the strength I had left into those 3 words. For a moment, Robert's grip loosened, and I thought he might actually release me. But then his hands tightened again, and he pulled me closer, close enough that I could feel his breath on my face and see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. "I'll let you go when I'm ready to let you go," he said quietly. "And I'm not ready yet. I've been very patient, Dorothy, very careful and respectful. But my patience isn't unlimited." The threat was unmistakable, even though it was delivered in the same conversational tone he might use to comment on the weather. Robert was telling me that he had been restraining himself up to this point, but that restraint was coming to an end. The implication was clear. Either I would submit voluntarily to whatever he had planned, or he would take what he wanted by force. At that moment, as if summoned by some guardian angel, I heard the distant sound of Daniel's car turning into our driveway. Robert heard it too, and his hands immediately released me, stepping back with the smooth, practiced movement of someone who had choreographed this scene many times in his mind. "Think about what I said, Dorothy," he murmured, his voice returning to its normal volume and tone. "Think about what you really want from your life." By the time Daniel reached the backyard, Robert was helping me gather the scattered laundry that had fallen from the basket during our struggle. To any observer, it would have appeared that he was simply being helpful, assisting his sister-in-law with her domestic chores. Daniel smiled when he saw us working together, probably relieved to see what appeared to be normal family cooperation. "How was Memphis?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound normal despite the trembling that I couldn't quite control. "Productive," Daniel replied, kissing my cheek in the casual way of long-married couples. "The bank is expanding their loan department, and they want me to head up the new division. It would mean more money, but also more responsibility and more travel." I should have been excited about this news, about the recognition of Daniel's talents and the promise of financial security. Instead, all I could think about was what more travel would mean. More time alone with Robert, more opportunities for him to escalate his campaign of psychological and now physical intimidation. That night, as Daniel excitedly discussed his promotion and the changes it would bring to our lives, I sat at the dinner table in a state of emotional paralysis. Robert, playing the role of supportive brother, offered congratulations and asked thoughtful questions about Daniel's new responsibilities. He appeared genuinely interested in my husband's success, genuinely pleased about the opportunities opening up for our family. Only I could see the way his eyes would find mine across the table, the small smile that played at the corners of his mouth when Daniel wasn't looking. Only I understood that he was calculating exactly what these changes would mean for his campaign against me, how he could use Daniel's increased absences to his advantage. The weeks that followed Daniel's promotion were a study in carefully orchestrated psychological torture. Robert had learned to time his approaches perfectly, striking when I was most vulnerable and retreating before Daniel's return. He would appear in whatever room I was occupying, always with some plausible excuse for his presence, always ready with an innocent explanation if interrupted. If I was preparing dinner, he would offer to help, positioning himself close enough that our bodies would brush as we worked. If I was reading in the living room, he would join me on the sofa, sitting closer than was appropriate and making comments about the book that forced me to engage in conversation. If I was working in the garden, he would materialize with offers of assistance that always involved prolonged physical proximity. The psychological pressure was relentless and exhausting. I began to lose weight because my appetite disappeared, my stomach constantly churning with anxiety about when and how Robert would next appear. Sleep became elusive because I would lie awake listening for sounds in the house, wondering if tonight would be the night he finally abandoned all pretense of restraint. Daniel noticed my deteriorating condition, of course, but Robert was always ready with explanations that deflected attention from his own role in my decline. I was struggling with the isolation of our new home, he would suggest. I was having difficulty adjusting to Daniel's increased work responsibilities. I was possibly dealing with some kind of hormonal imbalance that was affecting my mood and behavior. These explanations were plausible enough that Daniel began to worry about my mental health in a way that only made me feel more isolated and helpless. He would ask gentle questions about how I was feeling, whether I wanted to see a doctor, whether there was anything he could do to help me feel more like myself again. His concern was genuine and loving, but it was also based on the false premise that my problems were internal, rather than the result of external persecution. The autumn of 1966 brought cooler weather but no relief from the psychological pressure that had become the defining feature of my existence. If anything, Robert seemed to sense that his campaign was approaching some kind of climax, that the time for subtle manipulation was giving way to a more direct and dangerous phase of his assault on my sanity and safety. It was on a rainy October evening, when Daniel was away on another business trip and the house felt particularly isolated and vulnerable, that Robert finally abandoned all pretense of family affection and showed me exactly what kind of man he really was. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner, the sound of rain against the windows providing a steady rhythm that normally would have been soothing but that night felt ominous and threatening. Robert entered the kitchen with the predatory quiet that had become his signature, moving close enough that I could feel his presence without having to turn around. When I continued with my task, trying to ignore him in the hope that he would lose interest and leave me alone, he placed his hands on my shoulders and began to massage the tense muscles there. "You're carrying so much stress in your shoulders, Dorothy," he said, his voice taking on that false concern that had become his trademark. "All this anxiety and fear isn't good for you. You need to learn to relax, to let someone take care of you properly." His hands were strong and insistent, working at the knots of tension that months of psychological warfare had created in my body. Despite my revulsion at his touch, I could feel my traitorous muscles beginning to respond to the pressure, some of the constant pain I carried beginning to ease under his manipulative ministrations. "That's better," he murmured when he felt some of the rigidity leave my shoulders. "See how much better you feel when you stop fighting and let someone help you?" The massage was another form of psychological manipulation, designed to confuse my body's responses and make me question my own emotional reactions to his presence. Robert was skilled at blurring the lines between comfort and violation, between help and harm, until I could no longer trust my own instincts about what was happening to me. When his hands moved from my shoulders to my neck, his fingers tracing patterns on my skin that made me shiver with a combination of fear and unwanted physical response, I finally found the strength to step away from the sink and turn to face him. "Stop," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I don't want you to touch me. I don't want your help. I just want you to leave me alone." Robert's expression shifted from false concern to something much more dangerous, a cold fury that transformed his features into something almost unrecognizable. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was seeing him without his carefully constructed mask of family devotion and brotherly care. "You ungrateful little bitch," he said, his voice low and venomous. "Do you have any idea how patient I've been with you? How much care I've taken to help you adjust to your new situation? And this is how you repay my kindness." The sudden shift from manipulation to open hostility was so jarring that for a moment I couldn't respond. This was the real Robert, the man who had been hiding behind months of psychological games and false concern. This was the predator, who had been stalking me through my own home, wearing the mask of family affection while systematically destroying my sense of safety and sanity. "I never asked for your help," I managed to say, backing away from him until I felt the kitchen counter pressing against my back. "I never wanted your attention or your concern. I just want you to leave me alone." "Leave you alone?" Robert laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You live in my brother's house, eat food that I help provide, benefit from my presence and protection, and you want me to leave you alone? That's not how family works, Dorothy. That's not how gratitude works." His logic was twisted but seductive in its internal consistency. Robert had spent months positioning himself as a benefactor, a helpful family member who was sacrificing his own needs and desires for the good of the household. In his version of reality, I was the ungrateful recipient of his generosity, someone who had failed to appreciate the care and attention he had lavished upon me. "You're not helping me," I said, trying to find words that could penetrate his delusions and make him understand the damage he was inflicting. "You're terrifying me. You're making me sick. You're destroying my marriage and my life." "Your marriage was already destroyed," Robert replied with casual cruelty. "Daniel doesn't know how to handle a woman like you. He's weak, passive, content with a surface relationship that never goes beneath the polite conventions of middle-class respectability. I'm the only one who sees the real woman underneath all that Southern Belle pretense. The attack on my marriage was particularly painful because it contained just enough truth to be devastating. Daniel and I had been struggling, largely because my psychological deterioration had created distance between us, but also because there were genuine issues in our relationship that Robert's presence had exposed and exacerbated. At least Daniel respects me, I said, trying to defend my husband and my marriage against this psychological assault. At least he doesn't see me as something to be conquered and controlled. Respect? Robert moved closer, trapping me against the counter with his body while his hands gripped the edge on either side of me. Is that what you call the way he treats you, like a fragile ornament? Something pretty to display but not substantial enough to engage with as an equal? Is that what you call the way he runs away to his precious bank every time there's any real emotion or conflict in this house? His words were designed to make me doubt everything I believed about my marriage and my worth as a person. Robert was an expert at identifying vulnerabilities and exploiting them, taking genuine problems and twisting them into justifications for his own predatory behavior. Daniel loves me, I said, but the words came out sounding uncertain even to my own ears. Daniel loves the idea of you, Robert corrected. He loves having a pretty wife who makes him look successful and respectable. But he doesn't love the real woman, the one with needs and desires and fire. He's too weak to handle that much passion. The psychological warfare was so skillful that I found myself actually considering his arguments, wondering if there might be some truth to his analysis of my marriage. This was Robert's particular genius, his ability to take real problems and use them as weapons, making his victims complicit in their own destruction by forcing them to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Robert's smile was cold and predatory, the expression of someone who had been waiting months for exactly this question. "I want you to stop pretending that you don't feel the connection between us. I want you to admit that there's something here, something real and powerful that you've been fighting against, because you're too afraid to acknowledge it." The delusion was so complete, so far removed from reality, that I almost laughed. Robert had convinced himself that his months of psychological torture had created some kind of romantic bond between us, that my fear and revulsion were actually signs of repressed attraction. "There is no connection," I said as firmly as I could manage. "There's no attraction. There's only fear and disgust and a desperate wish that you would disappear from my life forever." For a moment, Robert's mask slipped completely, and I saw the raw fury that lay beneath his cultivated charm. His hands moved from the counter to my arms, gripping me hard enough that I knew there would be bruises the next day. "You're lying," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "To me and to yourself. I've seen the way you respond when I touch you. The way your body betrays what your mind tries to deny. You want this as much as I do, but you're too proud and too frightened to admit it." The delusion was so complete that I realized argument was useless. Robert had constructed an elaborate fantasy in which my terror was passion, my revulsion was desire, and my desperate attempts to escape his attention were actually forms of encouragement. He had rewritten reality to suit his own needs and desires, creating a narrative in which he was the misunderstood hero and I was the conflicted heroine of some twisted romance. "Let go of me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the panic rising in my chest. "Robert, you're hurting me." "I'm not hurting you," he replied, his grip tightening. "I'm trying to save you from a life of emotional emptiness and sexual frustration. I'm trying to show you what it means to be truly desired by a man who isn't afraid of your fire." At that moment, as his hands moved from my arms to my face and I realized that he was actually going to try to kiss me, I did something I had never done before in my entire life. I brought my knee up with all the force I could muster, connecting with the most vulnerable part of his anatomy and sending him staggering backward with a howl of pain and rage. For a few precious seconds, while Robert was doubled over and gasping for breath, I had the advantage. I ran from the kitchen toward the front door, hoping to escape the house entirely and perhaps make it to a neighbor's home despite the distance and the rain. But Robert recovered more quickly than I had hoped, and his hand closed around my wrist just as I reached for the door handle. The struggle that followed was brief but violent. Robert, driven by rage and humiliation, seemed to lose all concern for maintaining his facade of family devotion. He dragged me away from the door with a strength that was frightening in its intensity, his face contorted with fury and something that looked like genuine hatred. "You little bitch," he snarled, his voice no longer recognizable as that of the charming man who had entered our lives so many months ago. "After everything I've done for you, after all the patience and consideration I've shown, this is how you repay me?" I tried to scream, but his hand clamped over my mouth before any sound could emerge. He forced me back through the house toward the bedroom, and in that moment I realized that all the months of psychological warfare had been leading to this, to the moment when Robert would finally take by force what he believed he deserved. The terror I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. This wasn't the slow, grinding fear that had characterized the past months, but a sharp, immediate awareness that I was about to be violated in the most fundamental way possible. Everything Robert had done up to this point, all the manipulation, all the intimidation, all the psychological torture, had been preparation for this moment. But just as Robert reached the bedroom door, just as I was certain that my worst nightmare was about to become reality, we heard the unmistakable sound of Daniel's car in the driveway. My husband had returned early from his trip, perhaps driven by some intuition that something was wrong, perhaps simply by a change in his business schedule. Robert released me so suddenly that I almost fell, his entire demeanor shifting back to his familiar mask of concern and family devotion with a speed that was almost supernatural. By the time Daniel's key turned in the front door lock, Robert was helping me to my feet with apparent solicitousness, his face arranged in an expression of worried care. "Dorothy had a little accident in the kitchen," he called out as Daniel entered the house. "She slipped on some water and took quite a tumble. I was just helping her get cleaned up." The lie came so easily, so smoothly, that I almost doubted my own memory of what had just occurred. Robert's ability to shift between predator and protector, between threat and support, was so complete that it left me questioning my own sanity and my own perceptions of reality. Daniel rushed to my side with genuine concern, checking for injuries and asking worried questions about what had happened. I stood there in his protective embrace, feeling the warmth and safety of his love, while Robert watched us with those cold green eyes that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. That night, as I lay in bed beside my sleeping husband, I finally understood that I had reached a crossroads. Robert's mask had slipped completely during our confrontation in the kitchen, showing me the true extent of his dangerous obsession and his willingness to use violence to achieve his goals. The psychological warfare that had characterized the past months was escalating into something far more dangerous, something that threatened not just my sanity, but my physical safety, and possibly my life. I could no longer pretend that time would solve this problem, that Robert would eventually lose interest and move on to other pursuits. His obsession had grown too strong, his sense of entitlement too complete, his willingness to use force too apparent. If I was going to survive this nightmare, if I was going to reclaim my life and my sanity, I would have to find the courage to fight back in ways I had never imagined possible. The numbness that had protected me for so long was finally beginning to crack, and underneath it, I could feel something stirring, not just fear and desperation, but anger. For the first time in months, I was beginning to remember who I had been before Robert entered our lives. The strong, confident woman who had believed in her own worth and her own right to safety and happiness. The battle for my soul was far from over, but at least now I knew I was in a war. And wars, I was beginning to understand, were won not by those who were strongest or most ruthless, but by those who refused to surrender no matter how desperate the circumstances became. The morning after Robert's violent assault brought a clarity I hadn't experienced in months, like emerging from a thick fog into brilliant sunlight. As I stood in my kitchen preparing breakfast, my hands steady for the first time in what felt like years, I could feel something fundamental shifting inside me. The bruises on my arms were purple reminders of how close I had come to complete destruction, but they were also proof that I had fought back, that somewhere deep inside me the woman I used to be was still alive. Daniel had left early for the bank, kissing my forehead gently and promising to return by dinner time. Robert was still asleep, or pretending to be, probably calculating his next move now that his carefully constructed facade had crumbled so completely. For the first time since he had entered our lives, I was grateful for these moments of solitude, not because they offered escape from his presence, but because they gave me time to think, to plan, to remember who I was before fear became my constant companion. I made my way to the bedroom and opened the cedar chest where I kept my most precious belongings. Buried beneath wedding linens and photograph albums was a small leather journal my mama had given me on my 16th birthday. I hadn't written in it for over a year, not since the early days of my marriage when life still felt full of promise and possibility. Now, sitting on the edge of my bed with the morning sun streaming through the lace curtains, I opened it to a fresh page and began to write. The words came slowly at first, my hand cramped from months of tension and fear. But as I continued, describing Robert's campaign of psychological warfare, documenting the escalation of his behavior, recording the specific incidents that had led to the previous night's violence, something powerful began to happen. With each sentence I wrote, I was reclaiming my own narrative, refusing to allow Robert's twisted version of events to be the only story that existed. Writing became my act of rebellion, my way of insisting that my perceptions mattered, that my experience was valid, that the truth existed even if no one else could see it. I wrote about the fear that had consumed me, but I also wrote about my resistance, about the moments when I had refused to be completely broken, about the spark of defiance that had led me to fight back when he tried to assault me. Over the following days, I established a routine of documenting everything. Each time Robert made an inappropriate comment, each time he positioned himself too close to me, each time he created a situation designed to make me uncomfortable or afraid, I would record it in my journal. The act of writing gave me a sense of agency I hadn't felt in months, a way of fighting back that didn't depend on anyone else believing or protecting me. But documentation was only the first step in what I was beginning to understand would be a long and difficult campaign to reclaim my life. I needed allies, people who could see through Robert's manipulations and support me in ways that Daniel, blinded by family loyalty and carefully orchestrated deceptions, seemed unable to do. My first thought was of Mama, but our remote location and Robert's subtle campaign to isolate me from my family had made regular contact difficult. He had convinced Daniel that my frequent visits to my childhood home were a sign of immaturity, an inability to fully commit to our new life together. Phone calls were monitored, with Robert always finding reasons to be present when I tried to speak privately with family members. It was Mrs. Henderson, our elderly neighbor who lived nearly a mile down the country road, who provided my first opportunity for genuine connection with the outside world. She appeared at our door one rainy Thursday morning, carrying a basket of fresh preserves and wearing the determined expression of someone on a mission of neighborly concern. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, dear," she said, her sharp blue eyes taking in my appearance with the practiced assessment of someone who had raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands. I was making my rounds with preserves for the new folks in the area, though I suppose you've been here long enough now that you're hardly new anymore. I invited her in for coffee, grateful for the company, and the excuse to engage in normal conversation with someone who existed outside the poisonous atmosphere that had enveloped our household. Mrs. Henderson was one of those remarkable Southern women who possessed an uncanny ability to see through polite facades to the truth underneath, and I could feel her studying me as we sat at my kitchen table. "You've gotten awfully thin, honey," she observed, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate slowness. "And those dark circles under your eyes suggest you haven't been sleeping well. Is everything all right with you and Daniel?" The question was asked with such genuine concern, such maternal warmth, that I felt tears beginning to well up in my eyes for the first time in weeks. Here was someone asking about my welfare not because she wanted to manipulate or control me, but because she genuinely cared about my well-being. "We're fine," I said automatically, the response that had become my default whenever anyone expressed concern about my obvious decline. Mrs. Henderson set down her coffee cup and fixed me with a look that was both kind and penetrating. "Child, I've been on this earth for 73 years, and I know the difference between fine and struggling. You don't have to tell me your business if you don't want to, but don't insult my intelligence by pretending everything is perfect when it clearly isn't." Her directness was both refreshing and terrifying. After months of navigating Robert's psychological manipulations and Daniel's well-meaning but misguided attempts to understand my distress, here was someone offering genuine, uncomplicated human connection. But I had also learned to be cautious about trusting anyone, even someone who seemed as genuinely caring as Mrs. Henderson. "It's been a difficult adjustment," I said carefully, testing the waters of honesty. "Having Robert staying with us has changed the dynamics of our household in ways I didn't expect." Mrs. Henderson's expression sharpened with interest. "Ah, yes, the mysterious brother-in-law. I've seen him around town a few times, though he doesn't seem inclined toward socializing. What's your impression of him?" The question was casual enough that it could have been simple curiosity, but something in Mrs. Henderson's tone suggested that her interest was more pointed than that. I had this sudden, startling thought that perhaps I wasn't the only person who had noticed something troubling about Robert's behavior. "He's very different from Daniel," I said, still being careful not to reveal too much. "More worldly, more assertive. Sometimes I think he finds our quiet life here rather boring." Mrs. Henderson sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "I imagine a man like that might have strong opinions about how things should be done. Might not be particularly patient with people who don't share his vision of how life should be lived." The observation was so accurate that I felt a jolt of recognition. Mrs. Henderson had managed to capture something essential about Robert's character without ever having had a significant conversation with him. Her ability to read people and situations was clearly as sharp as I had hoped. "He can be quite persuasive," I admitted, allowing myself to reveal just a little more of the truth. "Sometimes I think Daniel values his opinions more than he should." Mrs. Henderson nodded knowingly. "Family loyalty can be a beautiful thing, but it can also be a weakness when it blinds us to uncomfortable truths. Some people are very skilled at exploiting that kind of devotion." The conversation continued for another hour, touching on various topics that seemed innocent on the surface, but allowed Mrs. Henderson to gather information about my situation without making me feel interrogated or pressured. By the time she left, carrying promises that I would visit her soon and invitations to call if I ever needed anything, I felt lighter than I had in months. More importantly, I had the distinct impression that Mrs. Henderson understood far more about my situation than our careful conversation had explicitly revealed. She had given me a lifeline, a connection to the world outside my increasingly suffocating existence, and the knowledge that at least one person was paying attention to what was happening in our isolated household. That evening, when Robert made one of his casual comments about how I seemed to be in better spirits, how perhaps I was finally learning to appreciate the benefits of family companionship, I found myself responding with a confidence I hadn't felt in months. "I had a lovely visit with Mrs. Henderson today," I said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in weeks. "She's invited me to visit her again soon. I think it will be nice to have a friend in the neighborhood." The flash of anger that crossed Robert's face was quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough to escape my notice. He didn't like the idea of me forming connections outside the household he was working so hard to control. The prospect of my having regular contact with someone who might notice changes in my behavior or appearance clearly threatened his carefully constructed narrative of family harmony. "Mrs. Henderson is a lovely woman," Daniel said, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension in the room. "It's good that you're making friends in the area. I know the isolation has been hard on you." "Yes," Robert agreed, his voice carefully neutral. "Though I hope Dorothy remembers that family comes first. We wouldn't want her becoming so involved in neighborhood gossip that she neglects her responsibilities at home." The comment was delivered with his trademark smile, the one that made him appear concerned and reasonable to anyone who wasn't familiar with his methods of manipulation. But I could hear the warning underneath the polite words, the threat that any attempt to reach out beyond our household would be seen as betrayal deserving of punishment. "Of course family comes first," I replied, my own smile matching his in its apparent warmth while concealing entirely different intentions. "But I'm sure Robert understands that a woman needs female friendship, especially when the men in her life are so busy with their important work." It was a small act of defiance, barely noticeable to anyone who hadn't been watching our psychological warfare play out over months of careful maneuvering. But Robert understood exactly what I was communicating, that I was no longer going to be completely isolated, that I was beginning to rebuild connections that existed outside his sphere of influence, that his control over my daily existence was starting to crack. The weeks that followed were marked by an escalating battle of wills, as Robert attempted to reassert his dominance while I worked to expand my network of support and resistance. Mrs. Henderson became a regular fixture in my life, appearing for coffee visits or afternoon conversations with a frequency that seemed casual but was clearly intentional. Through her, I was reintroduced to a world where my opinions mattered, where my perceptions were treated as valid, where I was valued for something other than my compliance and submission. She also introduced me to other women in the community, who had their own stories of survival and resistance. There was Mrs. Paulson, whose first husband had been a drinker and a batterer, until she had finally found the courage to leave him in the middle of the night with nothing but her children and the clothes on their backs. There was Miss Catherine, a spinster who had chosen independence over marriage after watching too many of her friends disappear into lives of domestic servitude and quiet desperation. These women taught me that I wasn't alone in my struggles, that the particular hell I was experiencing was part of a larger pattern of male dominance and female survival that had been playing out for generations. They shared strategies for maintaining sanity in impossible situations, for protecting yourself when the people who should protect you become the source of danger, for finding strength in communities of women who understood what it meant to fight for your right to exist as a complete human being. More practically, they helped me develop plans for ensuring my safety and documenting Robert's behavior in ways that might eventually be useful if I needed to seek help from authorities or convince Daniel of the truth about his brother's character. Mrs. Henderson, who had once worked as a secretary in a law office, taught me how to keep records that would be credible to outsiders, how to document incidents with enough detail to be convincing while avoiding the kind of emotional language that might make me seem unstable or vindictive. But even as I was building this network of support, and beginning to fight back against Robert's campaign of psychological terrorism, I was also discovering just how far he was willing to go to maintain control over the situation. His initial response to my newfound confidence was to intensify his efforts at manipulation, finding new ways to undermine my credibility and isolate me from the support systems I was working to build. He began making subtle comments to Daniel about my increasing involvement with the neighborhood women, suggesting that perhaps I was becoming too dependent on gossip and female drama as a substitute for the mature emotional stability that marriage should provide. He expressed concern about the amount of time I was spending away from home, questioning whether my domestic responsibilities were being neglected in favor of social activities. More insidiously, he began to plant seeds of doubt about the women themselves, suggesting that Mrs. Henderson was a lonely old woman who enjoyed stirring up trouble in other people's marriages, that the stories I was hearing about domestic difficulties were exaggerated complaints from women who couldn't appreciate good husbands. He painted a picture of neighborhood female friendship as a toxic environment, where dissatisfied wives gathered to complain about their men and encourage each other's worst impulses. Daniel, already confused by the changes in my behavior and concerned about my obvious distress over the past months, began to listen to these suggestions with troubling receptivity. He started asking questions about my visits with Mrs. Henderson, expressing worry that perhaps I was becoming too influenced by women who had unhappy histories with marriage and family life. "I just want you to be careful, Dorothy," he said one evening, after Robert had made a particularly pointed comment about the dangers of letting discontented women poison a young wife's mind. "I know you've been struggling lately, and I worry that spending time with women who have had difficult experiences might not be the best thing for your emotional state." The irony was devastating. Daniel's love for me was being weaponized against me by the very person who was threatening my safety and sanity. Robert was using my husband's genuine concern for my welfare to further isolate me from the people who were actually trying to help me heal and survive. But I had learned too much about manipulation and resistance to be completely defeated by this new strategy. Instead of becoming defensive or withdrawing from my friendships, I began to document this campaign as well, noting the specific ways Robert was attempting to turn Daniel against my support system and recording my husband's responses to these manipulations. I also began to be more strategic about my interactions with both men, learning to present different versions of myself depending on what each situation required. With Daniel, I worked to appear more stable and content, demonstrating that my friendships were actually helping me heal rather than making me more troubled. With Robert, I maintained a facade of compliance while carefully gathering evidence of his continuing inappropriate behavior. The psychological complexity of living multiple versions of myself was exhausting, but it was also empowering in ways I hadn't expected. For months I had felt completely reactive, constantly responding to Robert's initiatives and manipulations without any sense of agency or control. Now, for the first time, I was beginning to develop my own strategies, to take initiative in shaping the narrative of what was happening in our household. The turning point came in early December, when Daniel announced that he would be traveling to Atlanta for a week-long banking conference. The trip was an honor, a sign of his growing importance within the regional banking community, and under normal circumstances, I would have been proud and excited about this recognition of his talents. Instead, I felt a familiar dread settling over me at the prospect of being alone with Robert for such an extended period. His behavior had been escalating in subtle ways since my friendship with Mrs. Henderson had begun, his comments becoming more pointed, his invasions of my personal space more frequent and aggressive. I had no doubt that he would see Daniel's absence as an opportunity to reassert his dominance in ways that might be even more dangerous than his previous attempts. But I was no longer the same terrified, isolated woman who had endured his earlier campaigns of psychological warfare. I had allies now, people who knew something of my situation and were prepared to help me survive whatever Robert might attempt. More importantly, I had a plan. The night before Daniel's departure, I made my way to Mrs. Henderson's house under the pretense of borrowing a recipe for Christmas cookies. Once there, I explained the situation as directly as I dared, telling her that I was afraid to be alone with Robert for such an extended period and asking if she might be able to provide some kind of support or supervision during Daniel's absence. Mrs. Henderson listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that lives sometimes hung in the balance of such conversations. When I finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap while she considered the implications of what I had told her. "I think it's time for some plain speaking, Dorothy," she said finally. "I've been watching your situation for weeks now, and I've seen enough to know that you're in real danger from that man. The question is, what are you prepared to do about it?" Her directness was both frightening and liberating. After months of hints and careful indirection, here was someone willing to acknowledge the reality of my situation without qualification or doubt. Mrs. Henderson wasn't going to pretend that this was a simple family disagreement or a misunderstanding that could be resolved through better communication. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've tried to tell Daniel, but Robert is so skillful at making everything seem normal when he's around. And even if Daniel believed me, what then? Robert is his brother, his family. How can I ask him to choose between us?" "You're not asking him to choose," Mrs. Henderson replied firmly. "You're asking him to protect you from someone who is threatening your safety and sanity. That's not a choice a husband should have to think twice about." She was right, of course, but the reality of family dynamics and male loyalty was more complicated than her clear moral framework could accommodate. Daniel loved his brother, admired him, had spent his entire life looking up to him as a model of masculine strength and worldly sophistication. Asking him to see Robert as a predator and a threat would require him to completely rewrite his understanding of his own family history and his own identity. "What if he doesn't believe me?" I asked. "What if Robert convinces him that I'm unstable, that I'm imagining things or deliberately causing trouble?" Mrs. Henderson's expression hardened with determination. "Then we make sure there's enough evidence that disbelief becomes impossible, and we make sure you have somewhere safe to go if this situation becomes too dangerous to endure." Over the next hour, we developed a plan that was both practical and psychologically strategic. Mrs. Henderson would find reasons to visit our house frequently during Daniel's absence, creating witnesses to Robert's behavior and making it difficult for him to escalate his campaign without risking exposure. I would continue documenting everything in my journal, but I would also begin leaving copies of the most significant entries with Mrs. Henderson for safekeeping. Most importantly, we established signals and procedures for emergency situations. If Robert's behavior became physically threatening, I would find a way to call Mrs. Henderson, or simply leave the house and come directly to her home, regardless of the time of day or night. She would ask no questions and provide whatever support I needed, whether that meant sanctuary, transportation, or help in contacting authorities. "Remember," she said as I prepared to leave that night, "you have nothing to be ashamed of and nothing to apologize for. You didn't create this situation, and you're not responsible for solving it in a way that protects everyone's feelings. Your safety comes first, always." The words were a revelation. For months, I had been trying to manage Robert's behavior in ways that wouldn't disrupt the family harmony that Daniel valued so highly. I had been placing his comfort in his relationship with his brother above my own safety and sanity, believing that a good wife should be able to handle family difficulties without creating dramatic confrontations or forcing impossible choices. Mrs. Henderson was telling me that my well-being mattered more than Robert's reputation, more than Daniel's family loyalty, more than the preservation of polite appearances that had governed my entire approach to this nightmare. She was giving me permission to prioritize my own survival over the complex web of family obligations and social expectations that had kept me trapped for so long. The next morning, as Daniel packed his suitcase and offered reassurances about his quick return, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not hope that Robert would suddenly change, or that Daniel would miraculously see through his brother's manipulations, but hope that I had finally developed the tools and support necessary to survive whatever was coming. Robert stood in the doorway watching Daniel's preparations with an expression that seemed casual but felt predatory to my newly educated senses. I could see him calculating, planning, preparing for the week of freedom from supervision that Daniel's absence would provide. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I was calculating too, and I was no longer planning just to endure whatever he might do to me. I was planning to fight back with everything I had learned about manipulation and documentation, and the power of women who refuse to be broken. The war for my soul was entering a new phase, and this time, I intended to win. The week Daniel spent in Atlanta became the most crucial 7 days of my entire life, a period that would either mark my complete destruction or the beginning of my liberation from the nightmare Robert had created. As I watched my husband's car disappear down our long driveway that Monday morning, I felt the familiar clutch of fear in my chest, but underneath it was something new and fierce, a determination that had been forged in the fires of Mrs. Henderson's kitchen and tempered by weeks of careful planning. Robert waited exactly 30 minutes after Daniel's departure before making his first move. I was in the laundry room folding clothes when I heard his footsteps approaching, and the sound no longer made me freeze with terror as it once had. Instead, I continued with my task, my movements steady and purposeful, while my mind cataloged every detail for the journal entry I would write that evening. "Finally," Robert said, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made my skin crawl. "Finally, we can stop pretending that there isn't something powerful between us, Dorothy. A whole week to explore what we've both been denying for so long." I turned to face him, and for the first time in months I met his gaze directly without flinching. The change in my demeanor clearly surprised him because his confident expression faltered slightly, replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. "There's nothing between us, Robert," I said calmly. "There never has been anything between us except your delusions and my fear. But I'm not afraid anymore." The transformation in his face was immediate and ugly. The mask of charm and false concern dropped away completely, revealing the cold fury that had always lurked beneath the surface. This was the real Robert, the predator who had been stalking me through my own home for months, and seeing him without pretense was both terrifying and oddly liberating. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he snarled, moving closer until he was invading my personal space in the familiar way that had once made me recoil. "Playing games with that old busybody, building your little network of gossips and troublemakers. Do you really think anyone will believe your hysterical stories about poor Robert, the devoted brother-in-law who's been nothing but helpful and supportive?" His confidence was shaken but not broken, and I could see him working to regain the psychological advantage that had served him so well for so long. But I had learned to recognize his tactics, and more importantly, I had learned to counter them. "I think people believe what they see with their own eyes," I replied, continuing to fold laundry as if this were a normal conversation about normal things. "And what they've been seeing is a woman who's been systematically terrorized in her own home by someone who was supposed to protect and respect her." Robert's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Terrorized? You've been living in a beautiful house, eating food I helped provide, enjoying the protection and company of family. If that's terror to you, then you're even more spoiled and ungrateful than I thought." This was his standard defense, the rewriting of reality that had been so effective in confusing and isolating me. But I had spent weeks learning to see through his manipulations, understanding how he twisted truth into weapons that he could use against his victims. You helped provide food by eating what I cooked and contributing nothing to the household expenses, I said matter-of-factly. You offered protection by making me afraid to be alone in my own home. You provided company by making every moment of my existence a calculation of how to avoid your next assault on my peace of mind. The directness of my response seemed to catch him off guard. Robert was accustomed to dealing with women who doubted their own perceptions, who could be convinced that their distress was their own fault. My refusal to accept his version of events, my insistence on naming his behavior for what it was, disrupted the psychological framework that had given him so much power over me. "You're making a mistake, Dorothy," he said, his voice dropping to the threatening whisper that had once made me weak with fear. "A very serious mistake. Daniel isn't here to protect you now, and that old woman down the road can't watch you every minute of every day. You're alone with me for a week, and I think it's time you learned some gratitude for everything I've done for you." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the cold calculation of someone who had been planning this confrontation for months. But instead of the paralyzing terror I would have felt weeks earlier, I experienced a strange sense of clarity. This was the moment Mrs. Henderson and I had prepared for, the crisis that would either destroy me or set me free. "Actually," I said, setting down the shirt I had been folding and reaching for the small bell Mrs. Henderson had given me, "I'm not as alone as you think I am." The sound of the bell ringing seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space of the laundry room. It was a simple signal, arranged between Mrs. Henderson and myself as a way to summon help without relying on a telephone that Robert might prevent me from reaching. Within minutes, I knew, she would be making her way to our house with whatever assistance she deemed necessary. Robert's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally a calculating coldness that was more frightening than his previous displays of rage. He was realizing that the game had changed, that I was no longer playing by the rules he had established, that the isolation he had worked so hard to create was no longer complete. "Clever girl," he said finally, his voice carrying a new edge of respect mixed with malice. "But bells can't ring forever, and old women can't stay awake all night. This week is far from over, Dorothy." He left the laundry room then, but his departure felt less like retreat than strategic withdrawal. Robert was regrouping, planning his next approach, calculating how to work around the new obstacles I had placed in his path. The battle was far from won, but for the first time I felt like I was fighting rather than simply enduring. Mrs. Henderson arrived within 20 minutes, carrying a basket of fresh bread and wearing the determined expression of a woman prepared for war. She took one look at my face and immediately understood that the confrontation we had anticipated was already underway. "How are you holding up, dear?" she asked, her voice carrying layers of meaning that Robert, who appeared in the kitchen as if summoned by some predatory instinct, would interpret as simple, neighborly concern. "Much better now that you're here," I replied, and the truth of that statement was evident to everyone in the room. Robert greeted Mrs. Henderson with his usual charm, but I could see the effort it required now that his mask had slipped so completely with me. He was working to maintain the facade of the devoted brother-in-law, but the performance felt forced and artificial in ways that would be apparent to anyone paying close attention. "Mrs. Henderson, how lovely to see you," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Dorothy was just telling me how much she values your friendship. It's wonderful that she has such caring neighbors to keep her company while Daniel is away." The comment was designed to sound appreciative while actually establishing the narrative that my friendship with Mrs. Henderson was born of loneliness and need, rather than genuine connection. Robert was still trying to control the story, still working to position himself as the generous family member tolerating his sister-in-law's emotional dependencies. "Dorothy is a remarkable young woman," Mrs. Henderson replied smoothly. "Strong, intelligent, and blessed with excellent judgment about people and situations. I imagine that's part of what attracted Daniel to her in the first place. It was a subtle but effective counterattack, praising my character and judgment in ways that implicitly validated my perceptions and decisions. Mrs. Henderson was letting Robert know that she saw through his manipulations while simultaneously reinforcing my confidence in my own capabilities. The verbal sparring continued for several minutes, with Robert working to establish his dominance and Mrs. Henderson systematically undermining his efforts. Watching this battle of wits was both educational and reassuring. Here was proof that Robert's psychological weapons could be neutralized by someone who understood how to use them. After Mrs. Henderson left, promising to return the next day with more baked goods and conversation, Robert abandoned any pretense of normal family interaction. He spent the evening prowling through the house like a caged animal, his frustration palpable as he struggled to find ways to reassert his control over a situation that was slipping away from him. That night, I barricaded myself in the bedroom with furniture pushed against the door, just as I had during the winter storm months earlier. But this time the act felt less like terrified desperation and more like tactical preparation. I wasn't hiding from Robert out of helpless fear. I was protecting myself while my allies maintained their watch from outside. The next morning brought Mrs. Henderson's return, along with Mrs. Paulson and Miss Catherine, who had come to help with what they described as Christmas preparations, but was clearly a coordinated effort to ensure I was never alone with Robert for extended periods. The house filled with female voices and laughter, creating an atmosphere that was completely antithetical to the psychological prison Robert had been constructing for months. Robert's reaction to this invasion of his territory was fascinating to observe. He tried various approaches: charm, irritation, subtle attempts to drive the women away through rudeness or inappropriate comments. But these women had dealt with difficult men before, and they were immune to his manipulations in ways that younger, more isolated victims might not have been. Miss Catherine, in particular, seemed to take perverse pleasure in thwarting Robert's attempts to control the household dynamic. When he made comments about women who didn't know their place, she responded with sharp observations about men who confused bullying with leadership. When he tried to assert his authority as the man of the house in Daniel's absence, she reminded him that he was a guest in someone else's home and should behave accordingly. The psychological pressure on Robert was immense and clearly taking its toll. By the third day of Daniel's absence, he was showing signs of the kind of instability that he had been trying to create in me for months. His carefully controlled facade was cracking, revealing glimpses of the rage and desperation that lay beneath his manipulative exterior. It was on Thursday evening, after the women had finally gone home and I was preparing for another night of vigilant defense, that Robert made his final, desperate play for control. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when he appeared with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses, his movements slightly unsteady from alcohol he had been consuming throughout the day. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation, Dorothy," he said, setting the glasses on the table with deliberate precision. "Just the 2 of us, without an audience of meddling old women to complicate things." I could smell the whiskey on his breath from across the room, could see the dangerous combination of alcohol and desperation in his eyes. This was Robert stripped of his carefully constructed charm, reduced to his essential predatory nature by days of frustrated attempts to regain control. "I don't drink," I said calmly, making no move toward the table where he waited. "Tonight you do," he replied, and there was no mistaking the threat in his voice. "Tonight you sit down with me and we work out the terms of how this is going to proceed. Because I'm done playing games, Dorothy. I'm done pretending that you have choices in this situation." The mask was completely gone now, revealing the monster that had been lurking beneath the surface of family devotion and brotherly concern. This was the man who had been terrorizing me for months, finally showing his true face without pretense or apology. But I was no longer the same woman who had cowered before his psychological assaults. Months of preparation, weeks of support from women who understood survival, and days of successful resistance had transformed me into someone who could face this monster without flinching. "The only terms I'm interested in," I said, moving toward the back door rather than the table where he waited, "are the ones that involve you leaving this house and never coming back." Robert's reaction was immediate and violent. He lunged toward me with a speed that would have caught the old Dorothy completely off guard, but I was ready for him. Instead of freezing with terror, I ran. The chase that followed was brief but terrifying. Robert, impaired by alcohol but driven by months of frustrated rage, pursued me through the house with a single-minded intensity that spoke to the depths of his obsession. But I had planned for this moment, had mapped every possible escape route, had prepared for exactly this scenario. I reached the front door before he could catch me, and ran into the night toward Mrs. Henderson's house, my feet flying over ground I had traversed in my mind 100 times during the weeks of preparation. Behind me, I could hear Robert's voice calling my name, alternating between threats and pleading, the sound growing fainter as I put distance between us. Mrs. Henderson was waiting for me, as if she had known this moment would come. Her house was lit and her door was open, and she wrapped me in protective arms that felt like the embrace of a guardian angel. "It's over now," she whispered, as I sobbed against her shoulder, releasing months of accumulated fear and tension. "You're safe now, and it's over." The sheriff arrived within the hour, summoned by Mrs. Henderson, while I collected myself and prepared to tell my story to someone with the authority to act on it. Robert had disappeared by the time the deputies reached our house, but the evidence of his violent pursuit was clear enough: overturned furniture, broken glass, and the unmistakable signs of a man who had finally abandoned all pretense of civilized behavior. When Daniel returned from Atlanta 2 days later, he found a very different household than the one he had left. Robert was gone, vanished without explanation or forwarding address. I was staying at Mrs. Henderson's house, surrounded by women who had become my family in ways that transcended blood relations. And waiting for him was a complete account of everything that had transpired during his absence, documented in my journal and corroborated by multiple witnesses. The conversation that followed was the most difficult of our marriage, as Daniel struggled to reconcile the brother he had idolized with the predator I described, to understand how he had been so completely deceived by someone he had trusted above all others. But faced with overwhelming evidence and the testimony of respected community members, he could no longer deny the truth about Robert's character. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice broken with shame and regret. "I'm so sorry I didn't see what was happening, didn't protect you the way a husband should. Can you ever forgive me?" Forgiveness would come in time as we rebuilt our marriage on a foundation of truth rather than comfortable illusions. But in that moment, what mattered most was that the nightmare was finally over, that I had survived Robert's campaign of psychological warfare and emerged stronger than I had ever imagined possible. The numbness that had protected me for so long was beginning to thaw, and underneath it, I could feel the stirrings of the woman I had been before fear became my constant companion. It would take time to heal completely, to trust fully, to believe again in my own worth and strength. But for the first time in months, I had hope that such healing was possible. Robert never returned to Millbrook, and we never learned what became of him after that terrible Thursday night. Sometimes I wondered if he had found other victims, other women to terrorize and control, and the thought filled me with sadness for the pain he might be inflicting elsewhere. But mostly I tried not to think of him at all, focusing instead on the long work of rebuilding a life that was truly my own. The years that followed Robert's disappearance were like watching a garden come back to life after a harsh winter. Daniel and I moved back to town, closer to Mama and my sisters, closer to the community that had once nurtured me before isolation became my prison. We sold that remote house with its painful memories and found a small place on Magnolia Street, where the sound of neighbors' voices and children playing reminded me daily that I was no longer alone. Rebuilding trust between Daniel and myself took time and patience from both of us. He carried enormous guilt about his blindness to his brother's true nature, about how his family loyalty had been weaponized against the woman he loved. I struggled with resentment that took years to fully release, anger at how easily he had been manipulated while I suffered in plain sight. But love, real love, proved stronger than the damage Robert had inflicted on our marriage. Daniel threw himself into making amends, not just through words, but through actions that proved he understood how completely his perspective had been transformed. He encouraged my friendships with Mrs. Henderson and the other women who had saved me, never again questioning the time I spent with people who truly saw and valued me. He learned to listen when I spoke about my experiences, to believe my perceptions without requiring external validation, to trust my judgment about people and situations. Most importantly, he accepted that the naive young woman he had married was gone forever, replaced by someone who had been forged in fires of survival and resistance. This new version of me was stronger but also more cautious, more aware of the potential for cruelty that could hide behind familiar faces. Daniel learned to love this transformed woman, to appreciate the steel that had been tempered by trauma, to see my vigilance as wisdom rather than paranoia. Mrs. Henderson remained a central figure in my life until her death in 1978, becoming the mother I needed during those crucial years of healing and growth. She taught me that survival was only the first step in reclaiming a life, that true victory lay in refusing to let trauma define the boundaries of your future. Under her guidance, I learned to help other women who found themselves trapped in situations similar to what I had endured. The work began informally, with whispered conversations after church services or quiet meetings in Mrs. Henderson's kitchen. Women would seek me out, drawn by some invisible network that connected those who had faced similar horrors. They came looking for someone who would believe their stories without question, who would understand the subtle psychological warfare that left no visible bruises but destroyed souls with surgical precision. I became what people now might call an advocate or counselor, though in those days we had no formal names for the work. I listened to stories of husbands who controlled every aspect of their wives' lives, brothers-in-law who stalked and terrorized, family members who used love as a weapon and loyalty as a chain. I helped women develop safety plans, document abuse, find resources, and most importantly, remember that they deserved better than the cruelty they were enduring. Daniel supported this calling completely, understanding that my own healing was inextricably linked to my ability to help others find their way out of similar darkness. Our home became a sanctuary where frightened women could speak truth without fear of judgment, where they could plan their escapes without worry about being betrayed or manipulated. In 1972, I helped establish what would later become the Millbrook Women's Resource Center, working with Mrs. Henderson and several other women to create the first formal support system for domestic violence victims in our county. The work was often heartbreaking, as we lost women who couldn't find the strength to leave dangerous situations, but it was also profoundly meaningful in ways that gave purpose to everything I had endured. Daniel and I never had children, a circumstance that might have been viewed as tragic in a different era but felt like a gift given our circumstances. The trauma of Robert's campaign had left me with health issues that made pregnancy unlikely, but more than that, I discovered I had a calling to nurture healing, rather than raise offspring. The women who found their way to our door became my family, their victories my greatest joy, their safety my deepest concern. As the decades passed, I watched society slowly begin to acknowledge truths that women like me had known all along, that abuse could be psychological as well as physical, that family members could be predators, that isolation was often a deliberate tactic used to maintain control over victims. The language evolved to include terms like gaslighting and emotional abuse, giving names to experiences that had once been dismissed as women's hysteria or oversensitivity. I began speaking publicly about my experiences in the 1980s, when the women's movement had created spaces for such testimonies to be heard and believed. My story became part of a larger tapestry of survival narratives that helped change laws, influence policy, and most importantly, let other women know they were not alone in their struggles. The work was never easy. Sharing traumatic memories, especially in public forums, required me to relive experiences I would have preferred to leave buried. But each time I spoke, women would approach me afterward with their own stories, their own needs for validation and support. The knowledge that my pain could serve a purpose larger than my personal healing made the difficulty worthwhile. Daniel passed away in 1995, after a brief illness that took him quickly and gently. His final years had been marked by a devotion to making amends for his earlier blindness, and he died knowing that our love had not only survived Robert's assault, but had been strengthened by our shared commitment to protecting others from similar predators. At his funeral, dozens of women spoke about how his support for my advocacy work had helped them find safety and healing. After Daniel's death, I might have retreated into quiet widowhood, content to tend my garden and visit with grandnieces and nephews, who filled the role that children of my own might have played. Instead, I doubled down on my commitment to the work that had given my life meaning. At 73, I was busier than ever, serving on boards, mentoring younger advocates, and continuing to speak wherever women needed to hear that survival was possible. The world has changed dramatically since those dark months in 1966, when Robert nearly destroyed my soul. Women have more legal protections now, more resources, more validation for their experiences of abuse and trauma. But the fundamental dynamics of power and control remain depressingly consistent, and the need for advocates who understand survival from the inside continues to be urgent. Today, as I sit in my kitchen in Charleston, surrounded by thank you cards from women whose lives have been touched by the work that grew from my own suffering, I can honestly say that Robert's attempt to break me became the foundation for everything meaningful I accomplished afterward. His cruelty taught me the depths of human evil, but surviving it taught me the heights of human resilience and the power of women who refuse to be silenced. The numbness that once protected me has long since thawed, replaced by a warmth that comes from living a life aligned with purpose. The fear that once defined my existence has been transformed into vigilance that serves not just my own safety but the protection of others who face similar threats. The isolation that nearly destroyed me became the foundation for building communities of support that have saved countless lives. I never saw Robert again after that terrible night when I ran through the darkness toward Mrs. Henderson's protective light. Sometimes I wonder if he found other victims, if some other young woman endured what I endured, if his story ended in violence or simply faded into the anonymity that allows predators to disappear when their hunting grounds become too dangerous. Mostly, though, I try not to think of him at all, focusing instead on the light that grew from darkness, the strength that emerged from brokenness, the community that arose from isolation. My greatest hope is that young women today will never have to endure what I experienced, that the progress we've made in understanding and addressing abuse will protect future generations from the kind of psychological terrorism that Robert inflicted. But if they do face such horrors, I hope they will know, as I did not know then, that survival is possible, that healing can come, and that even the most devastating trauma can become the foundation for a life of meaning and purpose. The river of life keeps flowing, carrying us past the rapids and through the calm stretches, around the bends where we cannot see what awaits us. We cannot control the current, but we can learn to navigate with skill and courage, helping others find their way when the waters become treacherous. That, perhaps, is the greatest victory of all, not just surviving the storm, but becoming the lighthouse that guides others safely home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.